So today I'm going to show you how to set up the Canon 1DX Mark III. And I got this big recorder tied to it, so bear with me here as I kind of balance everything and try to do this through a screen. But to start out, number one, I reset this camera to factory settings, and if you buy one brand new, it will look like this. Go make sure you upgrade the firmware first though. This camera's had quite a few firmware updates since it was new, and even if you're buying one used, it's a good idea to first go and download that new firmware. As of recording this video, they're at roughly 1.5, but there might even be a newer one since you got yours. So I kind of refer to these menus by their color at the top of the menu. So to reset the camera, you're going to go to the orange-yellow menu, the wrench menu, and then go over to number 4 and then down to reset camera, and that's going to reset the camera to factory settings. When you go in there, there's an option for factory reset, or you can just reset certain features individually. So today I'm going to walk you through the settings I use, but also try to explain the settings as I go through the menus. I'll try to go slower than my R6 settings video because a lot of people complained about how I went too fast. And I'm going to make my picture really, really small over in the corner, so hopefully you can see the menus really big. Hope that's good enough for everybody out there. I listen to the comments, I'm trying my best. So this first menu, you're going to have white balance, and you can just kind of leave that alone. Obviously, you can change that based on what you're shooting. Generally, if you're outside, you use daylight, and these are all pretty self-explanatory. So you can leave it on auto for right now. Set custom white balance is actually pretty cool. You can take a picture of a gray card, which I don't have a gray card handy, but you can take a picture of this gray card, and then you could select that, and you could pick which custom white balance you want it to do. So if you were to go back to this white balance menu and over here to custom, you can use this front dial to change which of these numbers on the bottom. But basically you could go in here and set custom white balances. This is really useful if you work in a certain venue or say a sports arena or something over and over. You can set your custom white balance for that venue, so every time you go there your white balance is set, and you say, oh, I know that white balance 3 is XYZ high school gym or whatever, concert venue, etc. And you can have that saved in there as a preset, so when you go back there again, you don't have to fiddle with it or figure it out in post. You can just go right back to it. Now, of course, if you're shooting RAW and you're using something like Lightroom, you can just build a preset. But anyways, pretty cool feature I use quite a bit. White balance shift is if you wanted to add some certain color to a white balance. So it's like, oh, this is tungsten, but it's a little green or a little pink. You can fix that here. Color space. I usually shoot RAW, so this doesn't really affect the RAW files. But generally, Adobe RGB, if you're shooting JPEGs and you want more colored data, that's all this basically is. sRGB has a more compressed color space. Adobe RGB has more color data, and you can read up on those two online. Picture style, this again only affects JPEGs. I usually leave it on standard, so I kind of get a good idea of what I'm getting off the back screen, because this will affect what you see on your playback on the menus, but it won't affect your RAW files. Clarity is the same thing. Turn this up or down, but it's only going to affect those JPEG files. Lens corrections, same again. This will only affect your JPEG files, but we can turn it off. Your JPEG quality, here you can dial in how much compression is basically applied to each of your file format types. So in addition to being a smaller or larger file, the compression of them is set by this menu. 8's probably fine, but if you want, you can turn them up or down a little bit depending on what your purpose is. I generally probably wouldn't touch this too much. Image type, again, this is based on what you use. You're going to have the front dial will adjust your top menu, and your back dial will adjust the other one. I'm going to use RAW and no JPEG. Some events I have to shoot JPEG, so I'll shoot RAW plus JPEG, or I'll split them between two memory cards and shoot RAW to one and JPEG to another. But generally speaking, I'm just going to shoot RAW. That's basically all I generally need. ISO speed settings, you can change your ISO speed here. There's many ways to change this on the menu as well. For right now, I'm just going to set it to 100. If you want, you can change your range, so how high you can go. This doesn't really affect anything because it's still just letting you, it's just basically where you're allowed to select to, and you can set these ranges however you want, but yeah, they're basically the range in which you can select in the other menus. And then auto range would give you a range of where you can go as far as auto. So, and this is if you're using the auto ISO, how high up will you let it go? I generally just leave these at the defaults, or pretty much the defaults. You don't really need to worry about it. Minimum shutter speed is, you know, you can adjust this. So basically it knows what shutter speed to use. Guess I'll set it a little bit faster, but it, you know, it's up to personal preference, very much so. Auto lighting optimizer, long exposure noise reduction, high ISO noise reduction, and highlight tone priority. These are again all JPEG settings. So if you're shooting JPEG, you can turn these on or off as you need, but these are all going to be overridden if you're shooting RAW, which I assume most people are shooting RAW at this point. But if you're not, you can mess with these a little bit. If you want to do these things in post, you can. If you're not as computer savvy, these will help you out, kind of get rid of some of that noise right in the camera. Again, this is very much personal preference. Image review, this is when you take a picture, it automatically shows you the picture on the back of the camera. I always turn this off, and you can go to any number of settings, but basically all this is after you take a picture, it shows the picture on your back LCD screen. As a professional, I hate this. I want to just be able to keep shooting, so I always turn it off. Release shutter without card. This has two options, and it's either on or off. Basically, this allows the camera to fire without a memory card in it. And if you're testing your camera, like at a rental house, a lot of times you'll see this turned on. However, me, I don't want to be able to take pictures without a memory card in it, because if I don't look close enough and I don't notice, then I could easily be caught taking pictures with no memory card, and that is very bad. So disable that. Mirror lockup. This is so for like landscape photographers and astrophotographers, a lot of times we'll put the mirror up and then let the camera fire. And the idea is to reduce shake when you're doing like pictures of stars and stuff like that. I leave it off generally because I don't do a lot of that type of photography, but if you do, that's a great setting to have. Dust delete data is for being able to figure out where dust is on your sensor. I'm going to skip over that for now. External speedlight control, this is kind of for when you have a flash on board, and you can go in here and dive into some settings. I'm gonna basically just leave this alone for right now, but yeah, you can go in here and dial in a lot of flash settings that I don't generally use on camera flash almost ever, but you know, if I'm doing lighting, I use off camera flash, and then I'm just manually overriding everything. But that's where you can control some of that. Anti-flicker shooting, this is kind of to override if you have flickering lights and stuff like that. I have it off. If you're shooting in an arena that like has, or a place that has a lot of flickering lights, sometimes you can turn that on and it'll try to like sync up, is my understanding. You can see how often I use it because I don't really have too much knowledge of it. And I don't shoot a lot of high school sports, which is where this is more of a problem, where the lights will cycle, as they call it. But I don't do that anymore as much, so I haven't used it too much. Multiple exposure, you can enable in-camera multiple exposures. If your name's Aaron Doster, you probably use this feature all the time. It's a slight jab. But if, you know, basically this is to allow you to be able to make multiple pictures and they'll come out in one file. That's the idea here. You can do this in Photoshop as well by just combining the photographs after the fact. But you know, you can set some things in here. If you were to enable it, you could, you know, basically set how the photographs are added together. If they're additive, meaning that like the brightness is stacked on top, or you just add the dark parts of the photo, or average. There's a lot of settings in here. Basically, it's all diving into the multiple exposure menu, but day to day, you'd want this off. HDR PQ, boy, I have never used this, so to be honest, I have no idea. But yeah, don't use it, shoot raw. So, and live view shooting, you can turn this off if you wanted to, but I use live view quite a bit. So you can use it to get overhead or way down low, or just for whatever reason. So if you wanted to disable it so you don't accidentally flip into it, you could disable it there. Autofocus. This is very subjective. A lot of people use a lot of different things. It's broken down to 5 menus. The first menu is this vertical menu. I will say that most people don't really have a good grasp on what these do. And that's to say that like a lot of people don't really know what each one of these is really good for. And I might be in that group. A lot of, I never really got a class in this either. They're kind of self-explanatory and pretty subtle in their differences. I would say that most of the time I'm using case 2 or case 4. I'd have to go pick up my other camera to figure out exactly what setting I generally use, so it doesn't make a huge difference. It does and it doesn't. But basically case 1 is just kind of does what it does. 2, this is good if things are running in front of your subjects. So, this is like good if you're following someone at a concert, say, and then someone else walks in front of them. It'll kind of stay on that first person a little longer. 3 is very much like snaps to and fro. So instead of staying on that person in the background of the concert and avoiding the person in the front, it would snap right to that person in the front and then snap back again. And there's time and place for each of these. Case 4 is for subjects that accelerate or decelerate quickly. So I think this is kind of more responsive. I feel like I generally land on 2 or 4. I'm going to set this to 2 and I'll reset it when I set my settings, but I would say try 2 or 4. 3 is going to be very aggressive to like snap back and forth, which you could be good, but probably not the best fit for everybody. And then inside of these, you can hit the info button, or no, I'm sorry, the record lock button, and then you can go in here and you can adjust these to be more locked on or more responsive. But try it for a bit and adjust as needed. I would say the worst thing you do is go in and dial one in. I personally feel that every camera will have autofocus issues. Everything I've ever tried is always like never 100% perfect. So it's like getting it as best you can. But yeah, I'm usually on 2 or 4 on this one. Menu 2 is all for AI servo, so servo autofocus, which is what I always recommend people use. So basically this is, do you want the camera to wait until something's in focus, or do you want it to go when you say fire? I think equals pretty good. If anything, I would scoot towards focus more. And then second priority is, do you want the camera to just fire through, like say you take a 10 picture burst, do you want the camera to try to worry more about focusing and making sure every picture is perfectly in focus, or do you want it to like make that 14 picture burst or 10 whatever, and that's what you're deciding on here. I'm gonna leave it at 0 for right now. If I've adjusted in the past, I wouldn't have known. So what this is basically saying is, if you have a lens that's a drive-by wire, so the 85 1.2 is a great example of this. It basically means that the focus ring is not mechanically attached to the focusing gears inside the lens. You can basically say, do you want it to override that and so it's always active, or do you want to wait until you switch the lens to manual focus? I'm gonna leave it off. These are all kind of manual focus menus. AF assist beam, you can leave it on or off. I'm gonna use IR only. That's actually what I would prefer. So basically, if you have a flash on or something, it'll light up the scene a little bit so your camera can focus a little better. That's basically all it's doing. And then one shot AF release priority, I would always have this over to focus. So if you are going to use one shot autofocus, you obviously want the camera to focus 100% before the picture is taken. Subject tracking settings. So this is what's kind of new to the 1DX Mark III. So if you're following along on a 1DX Mark II or 1, you're not going to have any of this stuff. But AF priority people, I would have enabled. And subject switching, I, based on my settings, use initial priority. So basically it's how it follows if there's multiple people in the area in which you're trying to focus on. I've used initial priority with success, so yeah. Selectable AF point, I generally swap this to only cross type points, but you could probably use all points and be fine too. If you know you like only want to use picture points at the side or left, this is basically which points you can select. I like cross type because those are the better points, so to speak. They're more accurate. And so I've just historically always done that because in the old cameras it made more of a difference probably than the new ones. So yeah. AF selection mode, you can basically disable the modes you don't want to use. I generally keep them all active because at one point or another I kind of use them all. But if you know there's ones in here you never use, then, you know, go for it. So the AF area selection method, you can either use it with this MFN button that's on the front by the shutter button. And so basically you hit this little grid button, the back where your thumb would go, it's the button most to the right, and then hit the MFN button. Or you can do that and then hit the main dial. It's personal preference. I've used both. I think I'm going to go with the main dial now, so that's the dial by your pointer finger when you're holding the camera. Orientation linked AF point means basically if you're holding the camera horizontal, the point you're using, if you leave it the same for both and you turn the camera sideways, like vertically, and physically hold it vertically, then it will change autofocus points to a different point, or it'll stay the same if they're same for both. But you could then change it the other way, and basically if you know when you turn the camera vertical you always want to use a different autofocus point or system, you can have it change. I've tried that before. Personally found it better to just leave it the same, but again, everybody has their own opinion and kind of how they use the camera. So if you want, you can have your camera set to the initial point for like zone tracking or face tracking. I have it set to the same point as what I have set for the point I move around. If you watch my autofocus video on the 1DX Mark III, you can kind of see how I have the autofocus set up. We'll get to it in a second. But I'm going to go with this bottom one. It's going to be the same one as the one I have set for my regular point. So we'll see how that works. AF point selection is basically if you want them to go, when you're selecting points, to go all the way around and then swap around to the other side, or if you want them to stop at the edge and go left or right. I always have mine set to stop at AF area edges. Point display, you can have selected point, all the points, selected point focused. These are basically when you look through the viewfinder, if the point's illuminated or not in that red. I always leave it on selected AF point because I can see where it's at. Yeah, so that just makes it really easy to see where the camera's focusing. And since I use servo, it's always like tracking anyways. Point brightness, you can turn to normal or brighter. It's personal preference. Status, so you can basically see the status of whether or not the camera's in focus and stuff like that, and where you see it, if you want it outside the view or inside the view. So it's basically whether it be on the viewfinder or outside the viewfinder. I guess outside makes more sense. AF micro adjustments, if you have issues with a certain lens, you can set it up on a tripod, set a target to it, and this is where you can dial in an adjustment. Say it's always focusing a little too far, it's always focusing a little too close. You can go in and fix that in this menu. Playback. This is for just basically anything you do in playback. There's not much I touch in here. These are mostly like things you do while looking at photos. But in menu 2, I will say the big thing I changed is this bottom item, image jump. And what that is referring to is the front dial by your pointer finger. And instead of jump 10 images, I have it set to jump to protected images only. And what that does is as I lock or tag photos in the camera during playback, I can then use that front dial to jump between locked photos. And what's really nice about this is that I can keep up tagging photos during an event, so when I get back to my computer and ingest in the photo mechanic, I can see all my tagged photos right away. But yeah, a lot of different options here. Most people kind of leave that setting alone, and that's one of the best time-saving things I have to like offer on, you know, when you're doing playback. That was really messy the way I said that. Playback information display, you can just kind of set how you want things to work. A highlight alert is if you want during playback to see if photos are clipped or have white pixels. AF point display, it'll show you where the camera's autofocus during playback. There's, you know, just lots of things you can do here. I again just generally leave most of these settings alone. The next menu is with the arrow here is just all wireless settings for like networking. I'm not going to dive into these because I feel like it's very complex. and it probably deserves its own video at some point. But basically you can enable this and you can tether to something and you can transfer files from the camera direct to a server. But yeah, I think if you're watching this video, this probably is not something you need to worry about. GPS settings, I do personally enable it for mine. And I usually use mode 1, so it's always tracking GPS. It keeps my time set perfectly at all times, which I like a lot. I'm like a big metadata nerd. I want all my times to be perfect. I want all my organization. And I set it to auto update. And, you know, position update, you can, it's basically just the more accurate it is, the more data it uses, the more, more battery it burns. So if you leave your cameras packed away in bags a lot and you take them out, this is probably a terrible setting to leave on because it'll burn through your batteries. I use my cameras all the time, so for me, I'm always charging the batteries and stuff anyways. It's kind of whatever. But anyways, you can do all that stuff in here, and then you can do a position log. Those are kind of cool. You can load them into software and kind of have like a GPS log of where your camera went and stuff like that. So on a road trip or something, that might be kind of cool. But there's a lot of cool stuff you can do if you have your GPS enabled with Lightroom and Photo Mechanic and stuff, and you know, they can pull that data and then automatically put the name of the town you were in or stuff like that right into your metadata and stuff, and that's kind of cool, and that's another reason I really like having that on. Record function in card folder. This is basically if you want to split files between memory cards or back them up. So by default, you can record, if you had 2 cards in the camera, you could record your photos to one and your videos to another. You could, the second menu here is probably the most, a good one to like see what you can do in here, but standard, I mean, it just writes photos to that memory card. Auto switch card would mean when that card's full, it'll go to the next card. Record separately, you could record one type of file to card A and then a different type of file to card B or 2, whatever. And the nice thing about that is like you can have RAWs go to one card and JPEGs go to another. That's the way I use it a lot. To note though, something I've complained about to Canon for years, if you like tag photos or do voice memos and you do record separately, your tags and your voice memos will only go to whichever card you're playing back, and you can set which card you're playing back in this menu too. And what I mean by that is, so say you're, like for me, I shoot football or something, and I'm tagging and making voice tags of the play or what photo it is and stuff like that. They will only go to the photo I'm playing back, which is usually my JPEG cards. So when I go to my RAWs and I ingest that card later, none of that information's there. So I got to then pull it from the other ones, or it's kind of a mess. But anyways, that's where you would adjust these things. So I generally keep it on standard. Or record to multiple if you want to keep a live backup and record to 2 cards, stuff like that. And then right here, this record/play, that's what I'm talking about, where your tags and your voice memos will only go to the card that you're playing back on. So that's about the only time I found it matters. But yeah, if you're really into tagging and stars or voice memos, you're gonna lose them. So file numbering continuous. This is basically like if you just want the camera to write the file numbers, it'll just go up from 0 and keep going. Or I think auto reset is every time you format the card, it'll start over at 0 again. Totally personal preference. I generally keep it on continuous and don't ever worry about it. File name. So this you can basically add your initials, or maybe you add a camera name or part of the serial number or something like that. So I generally change this to like my initials or a camera name, so like R5A or X31 or X32 or something like that. But yeah, it's good for just keeping your file names different. And what's nice about this is if you have bad asset management, at least you could go in and see the file name and kind of get an idea where that came from. Or if like you write a 3 on the front of your camera on some tape or something like that or whatever, you can go in and see like, oh, why are these pictures looking wrong? Or maybe there's a problem with my camera. You can tell from the file name which camera it comes from. But of course you can look up the serial number and all kinds of other things from the metadata. So, there's a million ways to do everything. Auto rotate, I always have this on. So that just basically means that on the back screen, the picture will be level when I'm holding the camera. If you turn it off, then the vertical pictures will show up sideways. They'll show up the way they were taken, or if that makes sense. Format card. You can format your card. One thing I will show in here is this little trash can icon. You hit the trash bin underneath the LCD. Generally, you want to use low-level format on this camera, is what I found, and that's a more complete formatting of the card. And so if we do that, it takes about the same amount of time. I guess technically they say it takes longer, but yeah, evidently some of these CF Express, I'm sorry, cards, some of them will have issues if you don't do the low-level format, I guess I found out over the last year and a half of owning this camera. So yeah, that's a little tip I've picked up. Display color tone and display brightness. These are for your back LCD screen. So if you're generally in bright environments, you want to turn that brightness up, or it's darker, you can turn it down. Auto power off. This is how soon the camera turns off. I'm generally setting it really high or just disable, because if I'm out working and I have them on, I want them on. But it is good if you're kind of lazy about that and you always accidentally leave your cameras on, then you don't come back to a dead camera like an hour or 2 hours or whatever later. Date and time zone, this is pretty obvious, but you can, I'm not in London, but you can use the GPS to set it, or you can set it manually. Language, English, viewfinder display. This is basically some items that will show up in your viewfinder that when you look through it. I usually have the electronic level. I turn that on a lot, and that is that little grid that they're showing in that bottom screen. And so basically you can look at it and have a little black box that'll go up and back as you tilt the camera. So it's nice to have. I like using that. Grid display is exactly as it shows down there as well. That grid, and then show hide. You can see your metering mode, your white balance, anything you want to see in here. These are basically little warnings at the bottom there. So yeah, so kind of cool to have that on or off. But yeah, you can turn those on or off, and they're going to show down below where you can see what you're taking a picture of. Info button display options. This again just adds or disables whether or not these show up when you hit the info button while you're shooting. This will be on the back screen, on the LCD screen. So I generally leave them alone because I just generally have them off. So custom quick control is, if we go back to this info button, this bottom screen, custom quick control screen, you can add or delete things you want to have in here to show. So you could say, okay, I'm going to add an item, and I want to add, whether or not my Speedlite control. So I got that now, and you hit OK, and so now you can add items to there. So you could customize this to your heart's content, whatever you find yourself needing a lot. If you want them to show up on that back LCD screen by hitting that info button, you can add those items there. So UI magnification is going to be, I didn't know you could do this, but basically if you need help seeing that back screen, you can go in here, double tap the menu screen with 2 fingers, and that will kind of bring up a bigger version, I guess. So that's going to be this back LCD screen. You could do a double tap with like snake bite kind of fingers here. Help text size, you can turn it up to standard or small. Again, this is all like user interface stuff. Video is, if you're in North America, NTSC. If you're in UK or something, you switch it to PAL. Touch control, this is basically just how sensitive the screen is when you're touching it. Beep, I always disable. I don't want my camera making any noises. And that's just like when you focus it and stuff like that, or use the menus. I always try to disable any noises like that. It's the worst thing in the world to make noises when you're taking pictures. Battery info is kind of cool. You can go in here, see how charged your picture is, or see how charged your battery is, see how many pictures you've taken since you last charged it, and also show the recharge performance, which is basically like how good of shape the battery is in. So if you're having a lot of problems with like your camera, the camera doesn't recharge and stuff like that, and you can kind of see how good a shape that battery is in currently. Sensor cleaning, so this is where you'd go to lock the mirror up to clean it manually, like with a dust rocket or like a sensor swab. And then also the auto cleaning feature is that it will do this little vibrate thing when you turn the camera off or on. So yeah, so this is, you know, I always kind of keep it on because I generally don't need my camera to turn on that instantly, that I can't wait a second for it to run its cleaning, and hopefully at least somewhat help keep the dust off my sensor. I feel like I always have dust on my sensor no matter what I do. So yeah, and if you want to clean now, that will just run that cleaning system right now. So if you disable it, this is where you'd go to also clean it. HDI resolution, you know, this is for hooking up an HDMI monitor, which I am doing right now. Save load camera settings on card. This is something I use all the time. So if you go in here, you can, once you have this all set up today with my help, you can go in here and you can save all that to your card. And what I recommend doing is saving it to a card and then downloading it onto your computer. My computer's over there, that's why I'm pointing this way. And you can save it on your computer, and then later if your camera's lost or stolen, or you know, you lose that memory card, that file, or you accidentally reset it, or a firmware update resets your camera, or I don't know what, or if you rent the camera, that's how I used to use it. I used to rent cameras, and so I'd set it up the way I like it, and I'd save the settings to the card, and I'd put the file on, and I'd send it back, and then when I rented the camera again, I'd say, oh, it's a 5D Mark II or whatever. Okay, I'm going to grab that, and I'd put the card in, and I could set up my settings again. That's how I do it. But anyways, you always want to have a backup of your settings somewhere in case you mess up and get rid of anything. Custom shooting mode. So these are modes you can enable. So in addition to manual, aperture priority, shutter priority, TV, program, all that, you can set custom modes. And so you can basically, once you have the camera set up a way you use it a lot, you can register those settings to a custom function, and then whenever you switch over to that C1 or C2 or C3, it automatically go to those settings. I'm gonna make a video on how I use that for kind of a cool thing, yeah, if you know, like, hey, I'm in the studio a lot and I want custom 3 to be 1/200th of a second at f8 with flash white balance and all those things, because those are the settings I'm going to use when I work in the studio, well then you could save that as like custom 3 and then go in and start off of that point and go from there. Reset camera we talked about already. Copyright information, this is where you can enter your name and your copyright details and all this stuff. And what that's nice for is that, you know, your files will have that embedded in them, which is a little bit helpful to have that somewhere. I always recommend going in here and entering your name, and then in copyright details just put all rights reserved, or if you worked at a paper or something like that, you can put copyright of the blank and blank chronicle or something like that. And it's just a nice way to have it already in the file. Of course you can do this in Photo Mechanic or Lightroom or whatever, but it's nice to just have it right in the camera, right in the file, so that if somebody, you know, took your file from your camera as you're on an event or something like that, it's already saved in there. Menu 5 is just basically like the legalese stuff. This is where you, like, you know, see, you know, the legal stuff they have to put in there. And then this is where you'd update your firmware. So you'd need to have the firmware file downloaded from Canon, and then you go into this firmware menu and you'd enable it. So whatever point this is in the video is probably what most people are interested in, and this would be the orange menu. This is like the menu where it gets very confusing, very complicated, I guess. It's not that complicated, but this is like the menu where people are like, I didn't know that was in there. So the first one's pretty straightforward. These are preferences. If you want your exposure compensation, your ISO speed settings to be in increments of 100 or like 100%, like one stop between them, you can do that. Or same thing with exposure level. So you can basically adjust how detailed your adjustment is on those settings. The bracketing auto cancel is where you would get rid of your, if you set bracketing to turn on bracketing, you would be able to turn it off quickly. When the camera turns off, turn back on, your bracketing's turned or gotten rid of as well. I leave it that way because I often don't want to like remember to turn off bracketing, then all of a sudden I've got 3 or 5 different levels of exposure on my pictures. Bracketing sequence is what it sounds like. You can change if you want to take the pictures in order from like darkest to brightest, or start with the normal exposure, then go brighter and darker. I don't know if there's a right or wrong version of this. I generally do the normal one and then minus and plus. And I guess I do that because if I'm taking a picture, I want the exposure I set to be the one when I hit the button, and then the two after to be the plus or minus. But yeah, if you're doing some kind of workflow where you're merging pictures together or something and it's more sense to you, like dark to light or light to dark, you can change that here. Number of bracketed shots, you can change that to whatever you want. So 3 or 5 is always good. Spot meter linked to active autofocus point. So this is where you can adjust if you're using spot metering. Do you want the spot metering to go off the center of the camera or where you're focusing? For me, I always change it to linked to active autofocus point. And the reason for that is if I'm focusing on something, I generally want that to be what I'm metering off of as well. Safety shift is like basically if you're using aperture or shutter priority, it will say like you're so far off that this can't be right. It will fix it for you. I don't ever want that because I'm usually know what I'm doing and kind of have the right exposure pretty close at least. But if you're pretty new to this and trying to figure some things out, maybe that's a good way to cover your butt. Same exposure for new aperture would basically be if your lens varies in aperture, like an f4.5 to 5.6. This will, they basically keep the exposure the same. So what this could be good for is the 200 to 400 f4 that has the teleconverter built in. You could turn this on and it would adjust your exposure to so you don't have to manually go in and flip your exposure, a stop or whatever, like, so you could do it that way. So if you could do it by ISO speed, ISO speed / shutter speed. So yeah, so I don't use a lot of variable variable aperture lenses. But I guess when I do, it would make sense for the ISO speed to change. And of course, this only applies to manual mode. This doesn't apply to aperture priority or shutter priority. So yeah, so it depends on what you want to do. But if you're using a lens that changes in aperture a lot or using those built-in teleconverter lenses or something like that, then this might make a lot of sense. Lock meter mode after focus. I guess it would change your metering mode based on when you lock it in with AE lock. Yeah, I'm gonna skip that. Restrict shooting modes, you can basically disable modes that you don't use. So when you're quickly going to change different modes, you can disable ones. I always disable program, and I also disable bulb because I don't use those ever. If you're doing a lot of stuff that uses those, then of course keep them and disable the ones you don't use. If I go out to shoot something where I want to use bulb, I can just go in here and turn it back on. But most of the time, this list limits, so I cycle through less shooting modes when I am changing between manual, aperture priority, or shutter priority. And I also only leave on the C1 because I only generally use the one custom setting. But again, you could change that. Yeah, metering mode, same thing. It can disable them. So metering mode using manual exposure. It's basically, do you want to use the one you have set elsewhere, or do you want to use a different one for some reason? So I'm going to use the one I use everywhere else. Shutter speed range. So again, this is if you know you're never going to go below a certain shutter speed or never go above one. For some reason, you could adjust these. I don't see a reason why not to just keep them all active personally. And aperture range is the same way. I have no idea why you'd want to limit them, but there's a case out there and they let you adjust it. Exposure and everything, micro adjustment. That's if you're having an issue and you need to adjust these. So yeah, so you can change your flash exposure or your AE exposure. I've never in over a decade needed to do that, so I don't know when you would, but maybe if a camera is malfunctioning, you could. Continuous shooting speed. Here you can adjust all of your high and low speed and medium speed shooting speeds. So yeah, so if you need to make the adjustment, by default they're basically the fastest they can be on the highs. Yeah. If you wanted to, you could limit your continuous shot count so you don't accidentally take a lot of pictures, I guess. Or if you only take a 10 round burst or something like that, or 10 frames, whatever. And then again with drive modes, you can do the same thing we did earlier with restricting the camera modes. And these I do generally turn off the self timers. I guess I'll leave them all on now. But yeah, I always turn off the timer ones because I hate when I accidentally somehow get to the wrong shooting speed mode. Viewfinder info during exposure. Most photography, this doesn't matter, but I guess what this is dealing with is if you're doing a long exposure and those little red lights are in there, they could affect your photo because they're bouncing around in the mirror box. I generally leave it off. LCD panel during bulb, you'd also want off for the same reason. They could affect those long exposures. So this camera has a small LCD on the bottom and this record card image size setting. Basically, it'll display down there in that bottom screen. And then you could also disable that button so you don't accidentally turn that setting, change those image quality settings by accident. It's probably a great idea to disable this button because I've definitely accidentally hit this button and all of a sudden I'm shooting medium JPEG instead of RAW or something like that. But basically, it's telling you where it'll display that or if you want to turn that off. Warnings in Viewfinder, yeah, I don't know. I never notice these things, but if they bug you, you can turn them off. Dial direction during aperture and shutter priority. So what this is basically the direction in which the settings go. I do actually change this. I can't remember which way I change it now because I obviously reset the settings. I'd have to mess with it to figure out which way I change it. But basically the button by your shutter button, this is, you can change the direction of your what that does if you're in one of those shooting modes. Aperture setting without lens. So this is if you're using lenses that don't have like an aperture information. All Canon lenses that are modern are going to do that, so I'm not going to touch this. But if you're adapting old vintage lenses or something to this, this might be something you need to adjust. Multifunction lock. This is something I use quite a bit, and basically this is what things are locked when you lock it with this, the on-off switch. If you turn it to the lock instead of off or on, it will lock dials and buttons. So I like to have it disable basically the dials, and I don't really use touch control, so it probably doesn't matter, but basically I have it lock both of these dials so my exposure stays locked while I have it set to lock, but I can still move my autofocus point around. I'm going to do this one really quick first before I get into custom controls, but this is the key button on the back of the camera. So it does a lot of different things. I had it use the default. So basically, if you touch it once, it will lock the photo or put a little, tag it for photo mechanic purposes. But if you hold it, it'll record a voice memo. The downfall of this is if you lock a photo, you have to unlock it to then go back and record a voice memo. But I use voice memos a lot, so I'm going to use that. And I also use lock. So, but if you only use recording memos or you only use locking, then you can change it to a different setting. Or if you use stars, you can change it to that. Custom controls. So this is a lot of stuff. I have an autofocus video, so that's probably gonna be more accurate, so go check that. But yeah, let's run through this. So I'm gonna use back button autofocus. What that means is I focus using the AF on button as opposed to the shutter button to control my focus. There's a ton of reasons why. I talk about in my other videos, but it's better, and try it. If you hate it, go back, but almost never does anyone go back once they kind of get it. So give it a day or two. Back button autofocus is a million times better. I switched many years ago when I was in college. You just have a lot more control. So I'm going to change mine from metering and AF start to just metering start. AF on, I leave alone. I have metering and AF start, and basically that means that is where my autofocus is going to be controlled. When I press that AF on button in, that is when my autofocus turns on. And then I still take pictures with the shutter button, but when I press the shutter button, nothing's going to happen with autofocus because I've put it to just metering start. The quick controller is the infrared button on the autofocus on controller. This is new for the 1DX Mark III. It's allegedly on the new R3 and whatever else comes next, I think. I love it. It's one of my favorite features of this camera. I'm going to change that from off over to direct AF point selection. What that means is as you move your thumb on this AF on button, it's going to move your autofocus point around. If you're not have high dexterity or stuff like that, this could be kind of frustrating. So I understand why you turn it off, but for me, I've absolutely gotten used to it. I love it. Star button I use as a second autofocus point, and it's a little complicated, so just go watch my 1DX Mark III autofocus video. But basically, I'm going to have this set to metering AF start, and when you go to info detail set, you can set the AF start position to be the registered AF point. Yeah, I go into a lot more detail in the other video, so just go check that one out. Depth of field preview button. You can set it up to a lot of different things. Some people like to switch between servo and one-shot autofocus. So what I like to use my depth of field preview button for, though, is unlock. If you leave your camera locked, like, you know, multifunction dial locked and all that stuff, you can hold the button down and then you can then change your exposure or stuff like that, and then you release it and you can go back to being locked. What's nice about this is if you have multiple cameras banging around while you're running around covering an event, or if you're in the studio or something like that, you have your camera locked all the time, but then you just quickly grab this button, turn your dial, make your adjustment, let go, and you're back into business. So I leave it on unlock. Lens AF off, that's if your lens has an autofocus button on the side of it. It's only going to apply like 400, 600, stuff like that. There's a bunch of different things you could have it do. But yeah, it's whatever you want to have it set as. AF off is probably not what I'd leave it set as in case it accidentally got bumped. I'd leave it on AF start. Your MFN button, I use this to have it switch to custom shooting mode. So I set a custom shooting mode. I can hit this MFN button, which is the button up by your shutter button, the little tiny one. And I give it switch to my custom shooting mode. It's nice because if you have something cool set up on it, you can quickly switch to it. I do find I accidentally bump it a fair amount, so your mileage may vary. MFN2, what do I have this set to? I have no idea what I have MFN2 set to, if I'm honest. So yeah. Yeah, I don't know what I have this set to, honestly. I'd have to look, and so I don't use it a lot, evidently. Set button, I have set to exposure comp. So this is really nice if you use auto ISO with like manual mode. So if you need to be at like 1/2000th at f4, but you're in a cloudy day and sometimes the sun's coming in and going out, you can use auto ISO, and then with the set button set to exposure comp, you hold down the set button and you can still adjust your exposure compensation. So you can use a manual mode with an auto ISO and still be able to adjust, what's coming out of the, how bright your pictures are, how dark you are. I use that all the time. You can switch your main dials in M mode. So I usually do this. I usually swap these so that if I'm using aperture priority, my front dial is aperture, and if I'm using manual mode, then my front dial is also aperture. Just more intuitive to me as someone who uses aperture priority a lot and manual a lot. That keeps them more the same. Multi-controllers, these are the little joysticks. I also changed the multifunction controllers to direct autofocus selection, just like the AF on button. And what's nice about that is if you hit this detail button, you can also have it set to go to the middle point when you push it in, which I prefer. So that's nice because if you move your point all around and then you want to get it back to the center really quick, you can just push in on that joystick and it sends it right back to the middle. So menu 7, this is your live view switching. So that's just how the live view switching behaviors. If it goes, basically to enable to switch between the two modes or not. Smart controller, I have it set to on. This is again that brand new IR joystick on the autofocus on button. And then if you hit the Q button in here, you can get your sensitivity. I turn mine up. I don't remember how much right now. But basically this is how you can change your autofocus points with that little AF on joystick. I will say it takes a lot of getting used to, so if you're new to this camera, give it a shot for a little bit, see where you get, and then, you know, go from there. But you probably want to turn up the sensitivity a little bit, is my experience. Cropping information, I'm not going to touch. Whoops. Timer duration, this is for, it's like your metering timer. I don't touch that. Shutter release time lag, I don't use this. This is, so basically this adjusts how quickly the shutter is released. But if you're stopping down, then the lag will go back up. So you'll have a more inconsistent lag between when you push the button and when the picture is taken. But if you're shooting at f6, 8, 11, 16, you're kind of going to have a longer release anyways. So it depends on if you want a more consistent release or a quicker release. If you're shooting wide open all the time, which I honestly am, you can use shortened and it'll release a little bit quicker. So memo auto quality, this is how good the audio quality is of your voice memos. 8 is probably fine, but yeah. Audio compression, if you're doing video stuff, you should probably be using a real audio recorder. But if you're using the camera, you should probably definitely disable this because you want the best quality audio you can get at all times. Default erase option, yeah, you can adjust this to do different things. Erase the selected photos, erase the raw, erase the JPEG instead of just the raw, whatever you want to do. Retract lens on power off. I don't know too many lenses that will auto retract that fit on a 1DX Mark III, but you know. Add IPTC information, so you can basically register IPTC information via the Canon software, and then you can automatically append that information. Just do it in Photo Mechanic for pretty much anything, but I guess if you want to save a step or do something in the camera, you could. And then menu 9 is to clear all those custom functions. The last menu here is the star button, star, and that is where you can add custom menu tabs. So you can add a lot of things you commonly use. This is something I always do. I'm not going to run you through it right now because this video is already probably way too long. So that was a lot of information and a very not pretty way of sharing it. These videos are kind of boring. I hope that it was helpful though. I know a lot of people really enjoy getting these videos and how I set up a camera, which I wouldn't have expected. I kind of made the one when I got that test unit to try it out. But anyways, I hope you enjoy this camera if you just got it. I've had this camera for a year and a half. I bought it the day it came out and I absolutely love it. It's still my camera I take to sports events. It's still my camera I take to pretty much everything. I have the R5 as well, and I use that a lot when I'm doing studio work or anything I need to be really quiet for. But I really love this camera and really hope you do too. If you have any questions, leave them down below or follow me on Instagram, Brett in Real Life. I try really hard to respond on either one. But anyways, I will see you in the next one.